And as night draws in on the 26th of December, Cromwell, Parliament and the army are determined that the king must pay for all this destruction. The next day, Charles is confronted with a stark new reality. The Commons pass a law banning all court ceremony at Windsor.
The ceremonies of state stopped, all the official doffing of caps, all the expected courtesies that would be normally afforded to a king were halted, gradually signalling to Charles, if he'd been under any illusion up to that point, that the end was coming and the sense of his kingly authority was ebbing away.
Charles would have seen it as a deliberate insult to him as king. He had lived as a soldier for years. There were times when he'd been on the run, where he had slept on earth floors. So it wasn't as if he was somebody who could sort of only, couldn't stand life if people weren't sort of bowing and scraping all around him. But, he was a king and kings were treated in a certain way, and to have this stripped away was clearly a threat and an insult.
Charles is left with one small comfort. His dogs can stay. This punitive action is part of the House of Commons' plan to put pressure on the king. By the 27th of December, the House of Commons is effectively in the hands of the new model army. The force that had faced Charles across the battlefield. But how did a military group come to control the House of Commons? Just a few weeks earlier, on the 6th of December 1648, Colonel Pride and a battalion of soldiers from the new model army arrived at Westminster. Any MPs who still favoured negotiating with the king were blocked from entering Parliament. When the MPs demanded to know by whose power this was done, they were told bluntly, by the power of the sword. It was unequivocally a coup d'etat. The remaining 80 or so MPs became, insultingly, known as the Rump Parliament, the last remnants clinging to a stripped carcass.
And that's it. At a stroke, about 270 peers are shorn from the Commons.
The Rump, and I call it the Rump because this is not Parliament as we understand it. It's not even the House of Commons as we understand it. This is those MPs who are compliant with the wishes of the army, effectively. There's been a military coup.
Oliver Cromwell is a member of the Rump Parliament. Officially, MPs were not supposed to hold military posts, but an exception was made for Cromwell in the light of his career. Cromwell grew up in the market town of Huntingdon and joined the new model army in 1642. Cromwell is second only in the army to the Lord General, Sir Thomas Fairfax, and is a celebrated war hero.
He becomes the most able, the most courageous, the most decisive of the soldiers that are produced during the Civil War, and he comes from almost nothing.
At the Cromwell Museum in his hometown of Huntingdon, there's a fabulous memento of his military career. Tell me about the sword. Do we know that this did definitively belong to Oliver Cromwell?
He's got his initials on it.
Where?
Just here.
Okay.
It comes down through the family, so we'd be pretty certain it's his. It's a classic cavalry sword, both for stabbing and swiping. It is a sword that a cavalry officer would have worn. It seems overwhelmingly likely that this is the sword with which he led charges into battle. I mean, one of the things we can say about Cromwell is that he never, ever left it to others to lead a charge. He was always willing to show his own courage and his own confidence by leading.
So is it the case that it was Cromwell's military career that really turned him into the leader he became?
Well, I think fairly early on he starts winning battles, and he never stops winning battles. I mean, it's almost impossible to think of anyone who fought on so many battlefields and won every time. Here's a letter that Cromwell wrote on the 6th of June 1645. So by now he's just been appointed as the head of the cavalry of the National Army, and he's about to plan the battle that is to happen at Naseby. And yet he is able to tell two of his loyal men that he'd recruited himself there's a weakness in the defences.
And the fact that he signed the letter with his full signature implies a degree of communication, of intimacy with his men, a degree of respect between them.
And it's a strong, bold signature, isn't it? Look at the way the sea is formed. I mean, the big sweeping sea. His signature on it, a handwritten note written under pressure before one of the greatest battles in English history. It's a wonderful example of this, strong, purposeful, determined handwriting of a man confident that he was on the winning side.
Cromwell's military prowess gave him huge influence, and by the 27th of December 1648, he's moved a long way from his humble roots in Huntingdon. He's moved his family to a house in Drury Lane, but he spends most of his time closer to the centre of power, Whitehall. Cromwell is now occupying a house known as the Cockpit within Whitehall Palace. However, his critics note that he's gone even further. Not only is he living in the palace, he's actually sleeping in one of the king's magnificent beds. Cromwell's military brilliance has got him this far, but as yet on the political battlefield, he's made no progress against the king. But all that is about to change. This morning, the Rump Parliament are sitting. What was once just a rumour has become one step closer to a reality. Cromwell is introducing a new course of action to break the stalemate. A committee has drafted an act, what at the time is called an ordinance, that the king be put on public trial and charged with treason.
To accuse a king of treason is seriously problematic on quite a few levels. Just on a basic level, how can you have Rex v. Rex? How can a king be charged with treason? And in treason trials, you're tried by your peers. A king has no peers.
When the ordinance is read, there's uproar. So shocking is the very idea that Henry Elsing, the clerk of the court, leaves the house in protest. For any ordinance to pass into law, it has to go through the parliamentary process of the day.
It would be initiated in the Commons, it would be read a number of times, it would then be sent up to the House of Lords, who, if the House of Lords confirmed it, would then pass into, it would pass into law.
But to pass this ordinance is an even greater challenge than usual, as what is being proposed has never been considered before.
In the past, monarchs have been deposed, they've been forced to abdicate, they've been killed. But what has never happened before is no king in England had ever been put on trial for any charge, let alone treason. By even suggesting having a treason trial, the only punishment for which is death, is in itself treasonable.
What makes Cromwell embark on this mortally dangerous path? There's a clue in the powerful speech he delivers to the House. If any man whatsoever should carry on the design of deposing the king and disinheriting his posterity, or if yet any man had any such thing, he should be the greatest traitor and rebel in the world. But, Since the providence of God hath cast this upon us, I cannot but submit to providence. It sounds like a riddle, but basically what he's saying is that since God has put them, the parliamentarians, in this position by allowing them to win the war, then he has no choice but to submit to God's will and try the king.
Providential thinking is very simply this idea that God's hand is in everything. So whether it's something small like toothache or a cannon backfiring, or who wins a war, or even whether or not you should put a king on trial for his life. People are looking for God's hand in this. Everything is part of God's greater design.
What this means is there's a tremendous anxiety about Puritanism. One is always looking for God's providence. And of course, the most obvious sign of God's providence is victory on the battlefield. If one wins, then God must want you to win, and you are thankful for that. But again and again, Cromwell refers to this idea that they are merely God's instruments.
It's really the key to him, I think. He's always looking for God's approval or God's direction in everything he does.
The problem is that at Windsor, Charles is also equally convinced that he's God's representative on earth. Charles spends much of his time at worship, following the services in the Book of Common Prayer.
The Book of Common Prayer is really the order of service for the Church in England. It's the liturgy, it's the prayers, it's all the things that the Church was expected to do and the way that services were supposed to be conducted.
Charles is defying a Puritan law by following this book, as they have banned it.
The Puritans found the Book of Common Prayer very much a Roman Catholic document, or at least something that smacked, as they would consider it, of popery. It wasn't the vision of a much more equality-based service. It was too ceremonial. It was too much like Rome and the Roman Catholic Church. It was too much like Mass, which had been outlawed.
There are two books in Trinity College, Cambridge, which embody the difference between these approaches to God, one of which is Charles's personal copy of the Book of Common Prayer. It is wonderful to think that this is the very book that Charles held in his hands, his Book of Common Prayer. Here on the cover are the royal arms, and inside an inscription, Charles Stuart Rex, a book he took out of his closet, 1648. The Puritans may have banned the Book of Common Prayer, but they have their own godly instruction manual. This is the Soldier's Pocket Bible, first printed in 1643 and handed out to all parliamentarian troops. It's almost like a motivational rather than a devotional manual. It's divided into sections. Each section has an instruction for the soldier and then a selection of verses from the Bible to justify it. For example, a soldier must not do wickedly. A soldier must pray before he goes to fight. And my favourite, perhaps the most inspirational, and let soldiers and all of us know that the very nick of time that God hath promised us help is when we see no help in man. So we have two sides, two books. Charles, with his Book of Common Prayer, unquestionably convinced that his right to rule is divine. And Cromwell and his new model army, marching into battle with this little Bible against their hearts, convinced that they too are following divine will. On the 28th of December, the problem for Charles is that God seems to have shown where his favour lies. He has lost the war and is a prisoner. Within the mindset of the times, God has shown his displeasure. This evening in the Commons, the proposal to try the king does survive its first reading. It's a solution which could ultimately demand the king's life. Parliament is one step closer to ending the impasse.